Thank you to Kitty and Brandi for sharing your wisdom with us today and your time. And my heartfelt thanks to all of you for your interest and time in being here. One last thing I'll just say for sort of housekeeping purposes, I've learned a practice recently that I'm really grateful for in another organization that I work with, where we talk about your needs, your access needs. If you need to go off screen, if you need to care for children, grab a bite to eat, just know that in this space, that is not seen as a problem. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, take care of your needs. If you need to go off screen, totally fine. So don't feel bad about that at all. We know you're here and giving us as much attention as you can. So thank you. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thanks, Lisa. So thanks, everyone. I'll just do a quick introduction and then give the floor to Kitty and Brandi. So Kitty Miller serves as Home Forward's Chief Administration Officer. Home Forward is the largest affordable housing agency in Oregon. Her attention every day touches their business operations, financial performance, HR, talent, organizational development, contracts, procurement, and more. Needless to say, she's an integral leader at Home Forward and immersed in all of their work. In her past life, she's consulted, designed, developed programs for organizations, built core skill areas in diversity, equity, inclusion, conflict resolution, and more. She is now part of Class 38, and we are so delighted to have you here today. Brandi, we're also equally delighted to have you here. She is also part of Class 38. She serves as the Executive Director of Portland Homeless Family Solutions. After Brandi, sometime in 2005, Brandi, I think after she graduated from college, she discovered the amazing city of Portland on a road trip and decided to stay here. She founded Portland Homeless Family Solutions in 2007 and has worked as the ED ever since. Portland Family Homeless Solutions empowers homeless families with children to get back into housing and stay there. Under her leadership, PHFS has grown from an annual budget of $78,000 with a staff of 4 to an annual budget of over $3 million and a staff of over 30. So thank you all, and we are so glad for your time and attention today. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor to you all.
Okay, well, hello everyone. It's really awesome to be here with all of you. So good to see many of you that I know and meet some of you that I haven't met before. And thanks Class 38 for showing up. So I'm gonna do a little bit, I'm gonna go first and then I'm gonna pass it over to Kitty to talk a little bit. I'm gonna do just some kind of historical and current information about homelessness. What is homelessness? Have we always had it? How do we solve it? What happens to someone when they experience homelessness? So we're just going to talk about those kinds of things, especially as it relates to race. And there's a little handout that goes with this talk. This is a talk I do sometimes. So I have a little handout for it. It's from this thing called Solution Salon, but we'll pretend that says Alf, Oregon. Okay, so homelessness, houselessness. We had a great conversation the other night at Class 38 happy hour where we talked about the difference between houselessness and homelessness. Houselessness is a term that folks have really started using because there's a lot of people that even when they don't have a dwelling that they can live in, they still consider their community their home. And so homelessness, houselessness, synonyms, and you can choose which one you like better. I have been saying homelessness for years and years and years, and so my neural pathways often say that for me, but they are interchangeable. So what is it? It's defined as living somewhere that's not meant for human habitation. Shelters, couches, cars, tents, clinics, emergency shelter. I mean, anything that you can't stay at forever. Healthcare facilities. Who experiences homelessness? This is quite the controversial question in Portland because we don't really know is the answer for how many people experience homelessness. There are some competing numbers out there, like the One Night Street and Shelter count that says maybe about 4,000 people a night experience homelessness in Multnomah County. We know that the Oregon Department of Education reports that around 3,000 students each year experience homelessness in Multnomah County alone. 22,000 students statewide experience homelessness. And there's a report from Portland State that estimates that probably more than the 4,000 number, there's probably more like 38,000 people in the metro area. And this is from 2017 that are experiencing homelessness. Visibly, anecdotally, we know that's probably much, much, much higher. So have we always had homelessness in our country? Pretty much. Homelessness started in America the day we became a country and stole the land from the Native Americans. There was no infrastructure here. So for the kinds of things that the colonists wanted to do. And so there was a lot of homelessness. There wasn't housing, there wasn't infrastructure. So the first time that word was used was colonial America. And then throughout the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, lots and lots of poverty, lots and lots of homelessness. And largely, the government did nothing about it. There were some soup kitchens and philanthropists that donated money to help solve issues related to poverty, but the government stayed out of the business and created a tax code where philanthropists could give the money to help the poor. Then we had the Great Depression, the biggest economic downturn our country has seen, where so many people were experiencing homelessness and poverty that the government was really forced to act for the first time. And the solution, as we know, was the New Deal. The New Deal did things like send people back to work through the WPA Works program, reformed the banking and mortgage industries so that before the New Deal, you could only get a 5-year mortgage. The New Deal reformed that system. You could get a 25-year mortgage, pay your house off over a much longer time. So lots and lots of people were able to own homes and start building that wealth, which is really important. The New Deal created entitlement programs, the unemployment program, Social Security was started in the New Deal. And all of these nice programs that the government created were available to qualified white people. For folks of color, Black, brown, and indigenous people, LGBTQ plus communities, immigrants, people with disabilities, they weren't left out of the New Deal, but they didn't get the cool wealth creating things like the white people did. But the government created the Federal Housing Administration with an annual budget of equivalent to about $80 billion a year to build and maintain housing around the country so that all the folks that didn't have a place to live would have somewhere to go. So the white people start owning their homes, building their wealth. Everyone else, well, the qualified white people anyway, everyone else, they get some safe, decent housing to live in. That's pretty nice. So the white folks continue to build wealth, and everyone has housing. So from the 40s to the 80s, we didn't really have homelessness like we do today. The World War II further stimulated the economy, bringing us out of the Depression. And for a good 40 years, we had a really strong economic situation here in America. And then two big things happened in the late 70s and early 80s that have changed our housing history. The first is the federal government said that inpatient mental health hospitals all had to close down. These are the places like the Salem Hospital, the Oregon Hospital. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was written about, where there was some really bad care of people going on. So government said, communities, we can't do this anymore. Those are all closed down. You now need to find some coordinated care solutions for all the folks that will be discharged. Well, that never happened. And now it's 40 years later, and we still don't have coordinated care solutions for people who experience severe and persistent mental illness. And that is definitely a big cause of our homelessness epidemic today. The other thing that happened is in the early 80s, the government cut the federal housing budget from $80 billion to $20 billion a year. And what happened was all of this units of housing all over the country, this infrastructure of housing stopped being maintained. Nothing was built anymore. And what was existing stopped being maintained. And some zoning laws were changed and some really crappy stuff happened, especially with Black and brown neighborhoods. And they became known as the projects, and they became, these terrible places that folks, had, with their racist lens, said, we have to tear these down. These are so terrible for the communities. These are blighted communities. So I remember when I was little, I watched on the TV as they dynamited these big public housing buildings, and people cheered and celebrated. But what we were doing was tearing down our nation's infrastructure of housing that we had let get into such terrible disrepair. And we didn't have any solutions for those folks that lost their housing. So in the late 80s and the early 90s, we experienced another epidemic of homelessness. And the government chose to act again, like they did in the 30s and 40s. But this time, the government did not pump money into infrastructure to build housing. The government pumped money into emergency solutions, like shelters, street outreach programs, emergency clinics. And we continue to experience the same epidemic of homelessness ever since. The government hasn't made any meaningful investments in housing since the 1980s. And today, we don't have enough units of housing for every person and family who needs a place to live. In Multnomah County, it's about 29,000 units that we need. And metro area, it's almost 50,000 units that we need to be able to house everyone who's here. So the causes of homelessness are varied and complex. I boil it down to 5 primary causes. First, the first two of them go hand in hand. Housing is too expensive and jobs don't pay enough. In Portland, we don't have enough housing for all the people that live here, and the laws of economics tell us that when supply is low, because we tore down our infrastructure of housing and never rebuilt anything in a meaningful way for people who make low incomes, so supply is down, but demand is up. What happens to price? Price goes up. And that's exactly what's happening here in Portland and in cities around the country. Housing is considered affordable if it costs about 30% of your income or less. That's what that means. And so the average 2-bedroom apartment in Portland right now, it's actually lower than it was a year ago. It's about $1,500 a month. For that to be affordable, your income would have to be $53,000 a year, or almost $26 an hour. We know that our minimum wage earners bring home about $28,000 a year, which ends up being about $1,800 a month after taxes. For them to find an affordable place to live that only costs 30% of an income, of a minimum wage income, they would have to find a place for $540 a month. And if you ever find a place for $540 a month, call me, text me, knock on my door, find me somehow, because we know it just doesn't exist. You can't even really rent a room for $500 anymore. Minimum wage earners would have to work 87 hours a week in order to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment. So, second biggest cause of homelessness, maybe the primary cause of homelessness, is persistent oppression and discrimination. The housing market has intentionally and systematically denied homeownership opportunities and thus wealth accumulation opportunities to all those minority groups I mentioned before: Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, LGBTQ+ communities, immigrants, people with disabilities. And so through things like redlining, which is the practice of taking a map of a community with all the banks gathered around the table and saying, where do all the Black people live? Let's draw a red line around those areas, and we're all going to agree that we're not going to sell any homes in those areas, right? Bankers, okay, we're all good. And that's literally what they did for like a long, long time. So folks, that the Black and Brown people that needed a place to live rented from a lot of white families that owned those homes. In some certain situations, Black families were allowed to own homes, but most of the time, the redlined neighborhoods, it did not happen. Discriminatory lending practices have contributed to homelessness. Displacement through gentrification has created, these things have created the racial wealth divide, where white folks have owned housing, have accumulated wealth for decades and decades and decades. They have enough money that they transfer about $140,000 between generations in a white family. versus the average Black family transitions only about $9,300 between generations. And this is the racial wealth gap. So that whenever you are experiencing a hardship, something that's challenging in your life, you lose your job, you get sick, there's a big copay, your car breaks down, you need new tires, whatever, there's a death in your family and you have funeral expenses, whatever the crisis emergency is, if you have $140,000, you're probably going to be okay. If you don't, because you have been denied the opportunity to accumulate that $140,000 intentionally and systematically, you don't have resources when those crises hit. So your diving board for whether or not you're going to fall into homelessness is much shorter if you are a Black or brown person. Even here in Oregon, we had it particularly bad. Oregon was founded as a white utopia, the only land north of the Mason-Dixon line where you could come be free of Black people. Eventually, Oregon decided, well, we want some of that free and cheap labor as well. So they made it allowed to be in Oregon during the day to work, but you had to be out of Oregon by sundown or else you were arrested. There's a show on HBO right now called Lovecraft Country that shows the terror of what it feels like to be in a sundown county and have to get out. And it's just unbelievable the way this show represents it. So I really recommend, if you haven't seen that already, check it out. In Oregon, we did not ratify the Equal Rights Clause of the 14th Amendment until 1973, which is over 100 years after it passed at the federal level. Here in Portland, we've also done terrible things. We have the Black and brown families in Portland, the red-lined neighborhoods. We're North and Northeast Portland. And 4 times the city went in through eminent domain and said, we are going to take these areas, all these homes, these businesses, these communities that are here, we're going to eminent domain, seize this land, bulldoze these vibrant communities, first to build I-5, to build the Rose Quarter, to build Emmanuel Hospital. And then Emmanuel Hospital had this opportunity to expand again and take even more land. So they seized it, bulldozed everything, but then Emmanuel didn't get the grant to be able to expand and do their capital construction. So all that bulldozed land sat empty for decades because they didn't get that grant to fund the hospital expansion. So there's just so many examples here in Portland of the way that racism and oppression have contributed to the racial wealth gap, have contributed to the denial of Black and brown folks to own property and accumulate wealth. And that makes that diving board so much shorter. Couple other causes really quickly: lack of affordable health care. Even once we had the Affordable Care Act, the cost of prescriptions and copays and deductibles are just astronomical these days. So many families that we work with at PHFS come to us because their family had a broken leg, someone got pneumonia, and they have these medical bills that they just can't pay. And so they have to choose between paying their rent, paying for their medical care, and that's a really hard choice to make. And lack of affordable childcare. The average cost of childcare in Portland is $1,000 a month per kid. Going back to that minimum wage earner who's making $1,800, paying $1,500 a month on rent, $1,000 a month on childcare, we are negative $700, and we haven't bought food, a bus ticket, any sort of gas or transportation, clothing, any school supplies, diapers. And you can see the income in these families. It's just impossible to make ends meet. So there are there's lots more information in this handout about what happens to someone when they experience homelessness. We know from brain science that homelessness produces the same kind of stress response that encountering a wild animal would in the wild, encountering a mountain lion, or having your baby trapped underneath a car, and there's that superhuman strength lifting the car up. That brain, those chemicals flood your brain, turn off the logical thinking part of your brain, and allow you to save your life. And that's literally the chemicals that are dispersed the entire time you're experiencing homelessness. So what could be a momentarily life-saving thing ends up being very traumatic and turning into a trauma that that can lead to early death. So that's a conversation for another time. But at this point, I will turn it over to Katie.
Thank you, Brandi, and really providing that wonderful overview of homelessness. But for my time with this conversation, I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on an individual organization and how that organization can contribute to homelessness. So like Kelly said earlier, I'm a member of the executive leadership team at Home Forward, but a little bit more about me is that I am the proud daughter of two parents who grew up in rural Tennessee, and I affectionately refer to them as Pops and Betty Jo. And for today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on my Pops. So my Pops graduated from Tuskegee University with honors, and he served as an officer in the United States Air Force. During his tenure, he held several leadership positions, and with his professional aptitude, he retired as a lieutenant colonel after 20 years of service. My parents stressed the importance of being a good person, education, working hard. So when I was in the process of buying my first home here in Portland, I called my Pops to give him an update. And he said, like, one of the most beautiful things he had ever said to me, because he spoke with this honest vulnerability. And he said, "Kitty, I would like to help you, but I don't know how." So this man who graduated from college with honors and held several senior leadership positions never bought a home. And a big reason for that is because he came of age when redlining and overt racist practices blocked Black and brown individuals and families from home ownership. My family and I were never displaced or homeless, but I share this story because it speaks to institutional racism and hopefully just gives you a glimmer of how systems and policies and practices constructed to maintain white supremacy has the ability to harm individuals and families for a lifetime. So Home Forward was founded in 1941 as the Housing Authority of Portland. And like all American institutions, we were designed to privilege whiteness and disadvantage Black and brown people, despite our stated mission of providing housing assistance to our community. So prior to today, when you have heard about Home Forward, you probably heard things like, Home Forward is a local housing authority and the largest provider of affordable housing in the state of Oregon. We serve over 15,000 households. Nearly 40% of these individuals are families with over 9,000 children that reside throughout Multnomah County. We have a national reputation as a leading public housing authority, and we're successful because we really do believe that safe, affordable housing is a necessity and a universal right. And we really do strive to be a community leader that creates public commitment, policy, and funding to preserve and develop affordable housing for all members of our community. And as the Chief Administrative Officer, I can confidently say that this is true. However, under the leadership of our executive, Michael Bonacore, we've been critically looking at our organizational history and how our past injustices continue to cause harm and our current practices uphold white supremacy. And if I'm being honest, the breadth and depth of this can't be fully captured in the short time that we have together. But I feel like if we're going to talk about houselessness, I need to surface a few impacts that have undoubtedly contributed to the displacement and homelessness of Black and brown people in our community. So the first one that I'm going to share with you is Vanport. So soon after our formation in 1941, thousands of workers arrived in Portland from all over the country to work in the shipyards that popped up due to World War II. Lots of these folks were Black and other people of color. And as a result of this migration to Portland, the Black population over a 6-year period exploded from about 1,800 in 1940 to 15,000 in 1946. Vanport, and then because of that migration, there clearly wasn't enough housing for folks, especially for Black people because of the redlined areas that they were forced to live in. As a result of this, Vanport was a community that was hastily constructed in response to this influx of wartime workers who migrated to Portland to work in those shipyards. Initially, Home Forward, we weren't interested in assisting wartime workers and their families with housing, but over time, our board surrendered and we begrudgingly agreed to manage Vanport. At its peak, this community had over 100,000 people and about 40% of those folks were Black. After the end of World War II, Vanport became run down relatively fast, and that was because it was constructed relatively quickly and there were low quality materials that was used. And Home Forward decided, rather than tearing it down as originally planned, they would keep it to avoid integrating the Black residents into Portland. Now, let's fast forward 3 years to the Vanport flood. The Columbia River ran along the edge of Vanport, and that was held back by railroad infrastructure and dikes. And in the days that was leading up to the Vanport flood, residents could see the river rising and they became concerned. However, Home Forward insisted that residents shouldn't evacuate. Before the flood, Vanport officials began patrolling the dikes, but they didn't issue any warnings to residents. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assured Home Forward that the dikes would hold and that Vanport would remain dry in face of the increasing rising waters. However, Home Forward still removed its files from Vanport offices, along with 600 or so horses from the racetrack. So I'm going to say that again. Home Forward made a conscious decision to remove paper and horses, but failed to warn the residents that they were in danger. And then on May 30th in 1948, tragedy struck. The Columbia River floods and the dikes protecting Vanport breaks. During the flood, 15 people are killed. The entire community is underwater, and nearly 18,000 people, many of them Black, are left homeless. After the disaster, Home Forward actively participated in racist practices and segregated Black evacuees into certain neighborhoods. The Vanport community is now West Delta Park, Portland International Raceway, and Herons Lake Golf Course. The next impact is one that Brandi referenced a little bit earlier. It's the Emanuel Hospital Renewal Project, which took place in the 60s and 70s. And although the Black community protested this expansion of the Emanuel Hospital, which was funded by federal money earmarked for urban renewal, the expansion nearly demolished 300 homes in North Portland. The federal construction funds ran out after the homes were demolished, but before construction was finished. And the expansion still took decades to complete. Home Forward was not the driver of the Emanuel Hospital Renewal Project. However, over time, we did benefit from this harm. Specifically, in 1971, an arrangement was reached to develop about 180 to 330 units of federally assisted low to moderate housing on the seized land. I'm going to say that again, because as a Black woman, I hear something completely different. So an agreement was reached in 1971 to demolish nearly 300 homes and the opportunity for wealth creation for multiple generations and replace that American dream with public housing. Home Forward is the provider of 257 of those units. By adding these units to our portfolio, it helped to build our organizational wealth and our standing in the community at the expense of Black and Brown individuals and businesses who had originally called this area home. And finally, the last incident that I'm going to highlight was an internal policy and practice that we designed that disproportionately displaced Black and Brown people from a resource-rich housing community in Northeast Portland. This occurred in 2006, in which time Home Forward applied for and received Hope 6 funds to revitalize the Iris Court cluster in inner Northeast Portland. I think it's important for us to note that the concentration of minorities and people of color in the Iris Court cluster was significantly higher than the city as a whole. This was a redevelopment project with a total development budget of over $37 million and resulted in the construction of Humboldt Gardens, which sits on North Vancouver Avenue. So upon return to the property, we attached a policy and practices that adversely impacted several households living at Humboldt Gardens, which was designed to promote housing, self-sufficiency through case management, training, and employment, support youth to reach their full potential, and to create a healthy and connected community. This policy was entitled our Opportunity Housing Initiative. It was adopted by our board with the goal of moving working families from dependency to housing self-sufficiency within 5 years. If individuals were unable to achieve housing self-sufficiency within that allotted time, they were exited from the program uprooted, and forced to move to another apartment community within Home Forward's housing portfolio. So besides dealing with a well-intentioned but extremely flawed policy, individuals were also battling individual, cultural, institutional, structural racism that has been in existence since race has been used to reinforce white supremacy. So the supports that we put in place did not acknowledge, let alone address this. So we had some individuals who graduated from the program, but I'm saddened to say that we had way too many Black and Brown individuals uprooted and displaced from their neighborhood of choice. So in closing, again, the breadth and depth of racial disparities and Unhoused today can't fully be captured in the short time that we have together, but if we're going to talk about it, I believe it's important for us to take a look at ourselves and to challenge the systems that help to create it. At Home Forward, we acknowledge with humility our past and our present day policies and practices that contribute to these disparities. And we're working to do better and be better as an organization for all members of our community, especially those impacted by white supremacy and flawed systems. So I want to turn it over to the group to see if they have any questions for the two of us.
I'll jump in. So excellent history. Thank you for that. And Brandi, thank you for your overview. Based on all of that, are you today prepared to talk about where do we go from here and what can we do, or what are we doing, or what is being proposed? Because I know there's a lot of money that's going to be collected or being collected now to go towards this issue. And I'm not really clear if there's an overarching guide or playbook to work on this problem. So would either of you be willing to share anything about where we're going?
I'll let you lead, Brandi.
That's a big question, Christy. And I think, do we have an overarching plan? There are some theories and best practices out there that are talked about, and we have, some ideas of a plan. But white supremacy is still real and exists. The places that are coordinating and building the plans are white supremacist government bureaucracies, right? And so it's really hard to break out of it. I'm hopeful there are things like the Right to Return project, which is bringing people back to North and Northeast Portland to live in that neighborhood, people who have been displaced and who have a family history there. So there are little pieces of things, and I think it's a big lift.
And I guess the piece that I would add is that I think that for me, I lead with, I think it's taking a critical look at our systems and recognizing that thread runs throughout those systems. So I don't think it's as simple as, I'm just going to check this box and it's going to make everything okay. And I think that's what makes it so difficult. And it's, I think, first folks being able to acknowledge that these disparities exist and the reason why they exist. And then in turn, being able to take that comprehensive view in terms of all the different systems and places that has to be addressed in order to be able to start putting a dent into a lot of disparities that impact the Black and Brown community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has to happen at that, like we talk about in ALF, it has to happen at that systems level, and it can't, it's not about us as individuals becoming anti-racist necessarily. It's about us as individuals changing the structures and systems that perpetuate white supremacy and racism.
And I just want to kind of throw in this space. There's a lot of really great folks who are involved in the housing industry that are in this space. So by all means, Brandi, I hope you might say it, but I would love to share the space with you too. There's a lot of folks that are committed to housing in our community. So by all means, if there's something that I'm looking at Margaret or Jacob that you want to add, by all means, feel free to kind of jump into the space too. So we share that with you.
Thank you, Kitty. I'm going to take up your invitation. Hello, everyone. I know most of you, but not all of you. I'm Margaret Salazar. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. We're your state housing and housing finance agency, and just appreciate the unpacking of all this. The history, it's amazing to me, even in our field, how we're having to do some basic education about redlining. to even people who work in the affordable housing arena and homelessness arena. So I appreciate you unpacking all of that. And Kitty, the description of Home Forward specific actions is really searing, and glad to hear all that conversation that you all are having. Many of you have heard me talk about some legislation that we brought forward in Salem this session, House Bill 2100, which is really looking at modernizing our homeless services system. And for the first time, explicitly naming racial equity, culturally responsive services, and culturally specific service providers as an integral part of the homelessness work, the work that we need to do to end homelessness and houselessness. And it's been a tough conversation, a lot of big conversation, but I would say that essentially the message is that the racial equity work is not a side project. It is the work. It is why we are where we are with this humanitarian crisis that we have. And so we all need to acknowledge that and recognize that, and that there are really the dialogue we've been having is around culturally responsive and culturally specific services and service providers, and making space for those voices and sharing that power and those resources. So the good news is that there are historic levels of resources for both the services, emergency services part, and the sticks and bricks. And I think those of us in the affordable housing arena have to do some work to tie those things together. We're not great yet. And I know Jacob is a leader in this in that arena of really the services and the housing development. So would definitely invite him to speak on that as well. Thanks everybody for convening this.
Yeah, hey everybody. I guess the place I want to start from is just Katie. It was really kind of emotional for me to hear the history, which I know about, and I also need to acknowledge to my fellow leaders that I was part of those Hope 6 project teams, and as I've been educated about racism and racial justice over the last decade, and let me put a pin in that, I certainly haven't arrived and have still a lot of privilege. Like, my career was launched because of big projects that displaced a lot of people of color, and it's really just been a point of reflection for me as a professional. I guess for me, like, some of the things that we're wrestling with in our organization is, we develop housing using the low-income housing tax credit. Attorneys and banks get rich off that sort of process. And so we're trying to figure out how we can use our Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher program as a home ownership platform, and wondering, after the banks and attorneys are done sucking profits out of the low-income housing tax credit properties, if those can't be conveyed to a resident ownership platform in some way. I mean, our balance sheet is like growing in an enormous way, and if we don't reinvest those profits, I guess for me it feels like we're perpetuating racism and discrimination. And I don't have any great ideas, but internally at our organization, those are the conversations we're having. And I want to give a shout out to Burke, because he's my classmate.
Thanks, Jacob. And it's good to see so many talented people on this call. It's incredible. I'm going to speak from a place of ignorance, and hopefully y'all can help me out. So currently right now, I'm working at Prosper Portland, which is the developmental arm of the city of Portland. And I'm not currently in a position of power to make housing decisions, but I'm learning more. But whenever people talked about housing and the need for housing and how that's going to impact the houseless community, I do a little pushback and say that I think that this is a lazy man's approach. Yes, housing is absolutely necessary, but based on my experience in the mayor's office with Cupid, I noticed that there was a lot of mental health and drug addiction services that were not included. And so we would talk about the need for a warm handoff. And the reason I bring this up is, are we looking, and maybe I'm completely off base, but are we looking to do housing developments that are incorporated with drug addiction and mental health services, so that way people don't have to travel halfway across the city to seek the services that they need, because any type of barriers to those necessary services and help is going to prevent people from seeking them out, and then that will perpetuate the cycle of returning back to homelessness. Is that something that is on point with what I'm saying? And if so, what are we doing to address that in the future? Because I want to use my voice if this is the right pathway. And if I am incorrect, please educate me on the proper pathway so that it can actually be of service.
Thanks for that great question, Burke. I think that you are spot on. So there is a real need for wraparound services for people that not everyone needs them, but some people do need wraparound services. And if it's not on site or really close in your neighborhood that you can get to really quickly and easily, it is a huge barrier, and folks don't go and get the services. So absolutely, we have a service system here in Multnomah County that is incredibly disconnected. Within the Joint Office of Homeless Services, there is a system for homeless families, homeless youth, homeless single men, domestic violence, the Sun school system, the mental health system, then there's the early childhood system, there's the anti-poverty system, the Multnomah Stabilization Initiative. All of these are different systems with different entry points to get into them. And so if you're a family that comes to our organization, comes to stay in shelter at PHFS, first of all, there's a year-long wait list before you even get to shelter. Then once you get to shelter, we say, oh, you also need mental health services. Let's get you on those lists, but it's a 9-month wait list for mental health. You only have 4 months in shelter. So you have, what are you gonna do for those extra 9 months? It's just so broken, right? It's so broken. So the Metro Supportive Housing Services mechanism is supposed to bring $250 million a year into the metro area to address this, that we're supposed to be pairing like Margaret said, the sticks and bricks, the capital construction side of housing with these supportive services, mental health care, domestic violence advocacy, child care, drug and alcohol counseling, employment training, all the things, right? All the things that people need. And so that's hopeful, right? We have a lot of money to build housing. We have a lot of money for services. And my big fear is that this white dominant cultural norm of urgency is going to ruin our historic opportunity to create this bridge between all these systems and all these silos. And the local implementation planning is just marching down the road faster than anything. And maybe this is probably a very controversial opinion, and I don't say this in a lot of spaces, and I'm only saying it here because it's ALF. It's a mess, and I feel like we're not doing what we ought to be to take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah, I wanted to add a few things, because Burke and I spent a lot of time having this, and even when we're talking about the space of how individuals go unhoused, some of the products that we have were never intended for the outcomes that they are meant to produce. I mean, the structure in and of itself has to carry a risk. And even as I've learned to reframe these conversations, I've said, okay, what we owe to individuals is primarily based on the tax base. Like, we owe individuals because we've redirected their funds through taxes towards the upward mobility in the secure outline for individuals to create a structure where they have financial mechanisms that catch them along a housing spectrum, right? So when we're looking at homelessness, there are 4 primary ways people go into homelessness: senior, mental health, foster care, and workforce. What we've seen is a disinvestment on all of the systems that catch Black and brown individuals systemically across the board, and they're overrepresented at every intersection, every single one imaginable. So Even while I was in Portland and we were looking at this, I, number one, believe those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So to change the narrative, you got to change the narrative. You don't see it. So how you even show up to spaces is this unnuanced, very systemic, structural way that already excludes individuals because upward mobility is not something that we're projecting for that community. Instead, we're synthesizing work that's already been divided very clearly. It's never like, I was going in about opportunity zones because of the structure of the funding mechanism. I was like, wait, capital gains into it in low income without the people in, like, we're not building pathways to shared economic prosperity. And that's what's going to create the housing stability. So, I put some links in there because once you start looking at this and it gets very frustrating, you start understanding capital stacking and environmental reviews and all these systems and structures. But at the intersections, at the very beginning, there's no shared economic upward mobility that people can attach to, so the system can catch them along the way. And unless we're starting to deal with that, all of the negative outcomes as far as the unhoused population will continue to grow in a growing economy, in a growing market, in a growing city. It's hard. It's like these systems don't need active participants to self-perpetuate. So you have to interrupt that. And what that interruption looks like is new tools, because all of this is made up in the first place. It's understanding how to carry risk for marginalized or low-income individuals so all the other outcomes won't get worse. And we all have a part to play in that. And when you're seeing this whole system and this idea around reunification, some of that is upstream investments. Others of that is rapid rehousing. And then another one is strategic investments. Like, how do we create onboards? And I think that that's where we can start figuring out where we connect. And it's very, very, especially as a Black person in Portland, I'm not in Portland anymore, but they're like, you can look around in every room and there's no Black people, but everyone's talking about Black and brown people. They're just not being promoted, not given jobs, overqualified, underdelivered in every space. And so we came up with a term in the office when it was like Burke and Nicole and I, and we would call this virtue signaling. We're going to talk about all of this ad nauseum. And then we would go and laugh and be like, yeah, I'm never going back to that, because nothing is going to happen except for this feel-good conversation where we're like, you know what, we talked about it, and it was this equity theater instead of redirecting investments towards a broader upward mobility and figuring out how to have upstream investments so people never fall into homelessness. And if they do, we rapidly rehouse them. And then we capital stack out that and offer new solutions.
Mic drop. Absolutely, Cupid. Like, yes, yes. So here's a perfect example of that. The homeless family system that PHFS is a part of, we have a rapid rehousing program, we have shelter, we have, prevention, all these different solutions. On average, we spend about $9,000 of money that's funneled through Home Forward to help families get stable in their rapid rehousing situation. They don't become not poor, they still stay. How we help them, it's not like at the end of assistance they like own a home. The systems are perpetuating poverty. Like, we're learning in ALF, systems get the outcomes they're designed to get, and our poverty system is designed to get perpetual poverty, people in poverty. There was a question about what are creative strategies for building wealth. Giving people cash. So that $9,000 that we funnel through Home Forward, that we have to pay to landlords and utility companies and debt collectors and all these people, there's all this research out there that if you just give to people $10,000 of cash money and you go back and talk to them in a few years, they've ended their poverty. They are employed, the kids are in school, they're part of the community, they have social capital, they're good. So if we just took that $9,000 that we're investing in 250 families a year and just gave it to them, we would change so many more lives than we are now.
I mean, I think it's asking ourselves these hard questions, right? Because as we look at it, police don't provide safety. Walkable neighborhoods provide safety. Extending the tree canopy, which in Portland has the biggest racial discrepancy as of 2020, which means it costs more to heat your house and cool it in the winter and the summer as a result of existing now, right now. in the city. So how is this capital stack putting people at a disadvantage as a result? It's just too expensive for them to be alive. And when our biases are informed by racial animus at a position where we can kind of influence outcomes, that's where we start having a problem, right? Because it's like all of these different tools are they're so amorphous and they're so fast moving. And if I were to ask my grandmother, she would just say, tell me how my neighborhood can get better, right? Tell me about the funding resources from Metro and from City of Portland and from the county, because it's extremely confusing when you're like, wait, 4% LIHTC? What does that mean in the built environment when we're voting on where the appropriation goes in the qualified allocation? Like, it gets so completely confused, and yet at the end of the day, the same communities seem to suffer. And we're like, okay, where are the onboards happening, right? And how do we build and unlock and unleash the ability of all of our community in a globalized economy? And that's what I think the biggest danger is that, like, unless we're creating onboards, a lot of people are able to work from anywhere. And those who are at the bottom will continue to be at the bottom from every single just reportable outcome every single year. And that's what me and Bert and a lot of us would get frustrated about, because we'd be like, okay, here's another conversation where it's going to report that every measurable outcome for Black or brown people is going to be worse, period, without a doubt. So it doesn't matter if it's like, and part of it, people were saying, okay, when we do this homeless work, that's reparations. I was like, no, reparations is where you're 1/16 Black and you get money, period. Anything other than that, that has a requirement that doesn't hand you the soft handoff towards upward mobility, that is not reparations. And let's not confuse it. What we're trying to do is create a thriving, connected community where your life outcome is not determined by the color of your skin at every single intersection that we can influence. And we can do it because all of this work is arbitrary, made up systems to organize how we exist together. That's why. And if we're seeing an overrepresentation of those unhoused, what in the system can we change in capital stacks so they can hand off and build wealth that catches them along the housing spectrum? And, you know, I love these conversations. I was really frustrated in Portland, and then I came to Spokane, and now I'm just angry all the time.
Brandi, I'm curious, when you were talking about the 9,000, you know, or 10,000, have there been any cities that have said, as a city, we're going to have this strategy, we're going to follow those families?
Yep.
Yes.
So Stockton, California, and Vancouver, BC are two of the ones in the developed world, but there has been research. Give Directly has been doing research for a very, very long time around the entire globe about cash transfers, but Stockton, California, and Vancouver, BC are the ones I would recommend looking into.
Debbie, were you asking about homelessness, or were you asking about
UBI
assistance? Oh, you were. Okay, I just want to make sure I understood what you were asking.
And I guess I'm curious what it would take, what y'all think it would take to make a pilot program happen like that in Portland. You know, when we're looking at $6 million being given for the purpose of water stations, I think that's what the number was, right, around town. I'm just curious what you think it would take. Good to know, Margaret. What can the ALF community do in order to help?
And I'm only going to speak from my particular agency. Like, we have been, the folks that are on the service side, we have been kind of playing around with this idea. And it's like, even though I work with some really great people within Home Forward who do some really great things, thinking different, thinking outside the box, kind of challenging the status quo is really hard for folks. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, the director of community service and I were like, we want some unrestricted funds so that we're able to kind of think innovatively in terms of how we offer programming for the folks that we're partnering with. But part of it kind of comes down to, you can't do this, you can't do this, or this is the status quo, or this is how the system works, or this regulation. And I think a lot of times we make it more harder than it needs to be versus just being able to get behind something that is going to get us a better end result versus what we're currently dealing with. That's just a personal example of like work that we're trying to do within our organization, who is doing good work, and yet we still have challenges to be able to kind of play around with something like that.
And Debbie, I'm so sorry, I have to run, but I'll just say one quick thing about what we're trying to do. We've got all this federal resource coming in, right? And the federal dollars are a godsend, and they are very restrictive. Unfortunately, it's great that Congress and the administration is setting that vision, but they're still coming through siloed, and they're still coming through where we're paying landlords and utility companies. We're not giving people cash in their pockets. So we're trying to figure out how we could leverage that big one-time investment that still has to be for those siloed things, but wrap around it with flexible state dollars and philanthropy to do the direct cash assistance and asset building. We haven't figured it out yet, but we'd love to continue working with folks to figure out how to make that happen.
And I have to do the hardest thing, but I'm going to do all day, which is attempt to wrap up this incredible conversation. I just want to be mindful of the time we asked folks to commit to. So huge gratitude for Kitty and Brandi for this conversation. Huge gratitude for everyone showing up. And this conversation on houselessness just continues to be incredibly rich and even emotional. So thank you all, and look for more. We welcome ideas, really, about conversations around houselessness, racial disparities, and more. So so keep the conversation going between yourselves and ALF Oregon. And like I said in the chat, look for another email with all the links that people have been posting in the chat. And thank you. Bye, everyone.